Hello, this is Tony Nicholls from Great Ideaz, and in this video I'm going to be talking about customizing individual field types within the trellispark framework's user experience. So let's have a look at the typical user experience and how it's all being laid out. So from a context perspective, here is a general page. Within the page, we have header functionality, navigation functionality, and then the functionality that's being rendered using our instance builder. Our instance builder has a command bar, and then everything from here downwards is part of the tab bar. And within the tab bar, we're deciding which tabs the user has read access to. So if the user cannot see the tab, it's not displayed. If the user can see the tab, then there will be a number of rows rendered within the tab. And in our previous video, we looked at how do you actually change the row definitions. So instead of using the generic 10 rows, you can have any combination of rows and row formats. And what we're going to be looking at this video is how do we customize the look and feel of an individual field within the row. So let's go and briefly look through some code and see what this looks like in Blazor. So at the highest level, our instance builder is displaying the command bar and the tab bar. So the command bar is this grey bar here, and the tab bar is everything from this tab strip down. The tab bar is rendering the tab strip, and then it's got a for loop in here that's determining which rows are visible to the user. And then within the row definitions, we are essentially laying out a set of named fields. So here is our generic definition, and here are the definitions that we introduced in a previous video to describe a left, center, right. And as you can see, they're all basically using this field component here. So what does a field look like? Well, the field layout component is going to display a label. It optionally has description information at the top and the bottom of the field. If you're using one of the Great Ideaz fields, that basically is sandwiched between the top and the bottom. And you can also override the Great Ideaz fields either by changing the Great Ideaz fields themselves or by adding your own custom fields. So let's have a look at how the field Blazor component works. So in the field Blazor component, we're displaying a table. The table first row has got the label on it and an optional required class indicator. Here is where we're rendering the description on top of the field, and here is where we're rendering the description at the bottom of the field, and here is where we're attempting to define the fields that need to be rendered. So by default, we're always going to try and look for the field in the GI field. And the GI field raiser component is essentially acting as a switch statement that routes the named field type to the appropriate Great Ideaz Blazor component that will be used to render that field. So let's actually go back to our code and try and do something a little bit more fun. So here, if I go to my data model and I look at my center field C12, I can see that this is being rendered as a string. Okay, so I have a list of field types that are available out of the box. And one of the field types that may be nice to have that isn't on this list is an ability to display an image URL. So what I'm going to do in this video is show you how to add a whole new field type to the trellispark framework. So the way we want to do that is we're going to go into the server owner and we're going to go into the field definition and change the field type. So here you can see that I've gone into the server owner functionality. You can see I'm looking at the server owner functionality. I'm going to forms, and from here I am navigating down into my field definition concept. inside the field definition, the thing that determines the field type is this subform X element. You can see it's mapped to the field type. I go here. You see down here are a list of all of my field types that are available out of the box. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new field type. So to do that, I'm adding a new subform definition. I'm going to call this display ImageUrl. And at the moment, I'm going to leave this blank. I just want to show you how to actually add a new field type. And during the course of the video, we're going to really refine this. So let's start by just adding a new field type. So if I go down here now, I can see I have a display image URL. If I go back to my server owner functionality, you can see I can clear the state. And now I'm going to go to my test rows functionality, and I'm going to change this field. And instead of it being a string, I'm now going to go here, and I want to try out my new display option. I now want to try out my new display field. So there's my display image URL. So this is the one I've just added. Save this change, go back to my functionality and tell it to clear the application state, and come back here. You see it says unknown field type. It doesn't know what display image URL is right now, right? It has a field type name, but there's no definition for what that field is going to look like in Blazor. So what's happening here is that I've gone down my instance builder, I've gone into my tab bar, I've gone to my razor, I've gone to my field, I've made the call here to my GI field. My GI field has gone looking for a GI field that implements this, can't find a Great Ideaz field that implements this, and it's just rendering unknown field type. So that explains why I'm seeing unknown field type here. So let's add a new component that will allow us to display an image URL. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to make some changes into our components project. So let's turn this off, and we will go into our components project, and we recommend that you create a new folder. You can call it what you want, but for this example I'm going to call it custom. Okay, so obviously delete the last bit, and we're going to start from creating the new folder for custom. So the recommendation is whenever you're creating your own custom components that you add a new folder and call it whatever you want, but we tend to recommend using custom, and we've now got a new folder called custom. So what we want to do now is we want to create a new component for our display image URL. So I'm going to go here, I'm going to select add a razor component, and I'm going to call it display image URL and add it. Okay, so I've now got a new component called display image URL.razor in this folder called custom. So one thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go and modify my imports file to include my new custom folder. Okay, so this is going to make this component visible right the way throughout this project. Okay, and that's very useful because what I can do now is I can go to my field razor component here, and I can add a new case here. So case display image URL. Okay, and I now want to change this to match my name here. So I'm going to call this display image URL. And you can see it's not very happy. I'm trying to pass it some parameters. It has no idea what those parameters are. So let's start by adding some parameters to this field. And I personally always find it easier to start by cheating and copying and pasting from an existing project. So if I now go back to my field razor component, we can see that this is very happy. Okay, so let's rewind this a little bit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this stuff into a new file. Okay, so I want to pick up from the point where I'm going to add my custom type in here. Okay, so let's start from where I've created this custom display field here and then work from there. Okay, so we have created a new Razor component called DisplayImageUrl. Now, one thing that we need to do straight away is we need to set up the standard parameter set for a Blazor component. So the standard parameters that we're going to need to be able to pass into a field include the name of the field, the user experience element, the definition, the instance, and the notification. So we're going to need these before we can do anything with a field. Okay, and you'll notice that all of the work that we do, we're always passing into our GI fields these parameters here. So what I want to do now is I want to add my new DisplayUrl field in here. So essentially what we're going to do is we are going to have a new case statement in our switch which will display ImageUrl that will then call our new custom component called DisplayImageUrl. So if I now rebuild this, you can see that we've moved along. We now have a DisplayImageUrl, which is essentially this component here being called instead of trying to pass the field type into the GI field. So we've already achieved the first element of this, which is the ability to add a custom field type. So now we've got the field type in the solution. What we need to do now is we need to make it do something useful. Okay, so I've now got this placeholder for a display image URL and I've added the Blazor component. What I now need to be able to do is do something interesting with this control. So the first thing that I want to be able to do is actually save the URL of the image I want to display. So to do that, I'm going to add another field definition to my subform. So on row 1, on the left position, I'm going to add XML element name. And this field will be a string. And the reason I'm doing this is that I want to be able to add a new X element into my record. And it's going to be a mandatory field. So for every field of type display image URL, I absolutely want to know what the URL image name is going to be. So if I mark that as done, and then I go over here to my server owner, tell it to clear the application state, and then I navigate to my test rows and open up my data model, and I go to my display image URL field here. You can see that I now have a field to put my X element name in, and this is set to C12. So this is what it used to be when we had it as a string, but now we've got this thing available as a display image URL. Okay, so what this is basically going to mean is that if I go to my AA field, I want to be able to put a text string in here. So let's start by going to our code for our display image URL, and we can take some of the code out of our GI string and we can massage it to fit our display image URL. So to start off with, we're going to want to display the string in a generic text box, and we can also take some of the code from our string definition here and add it here. So let's have a quick look at what this code is doing. So we want the field just to make sure it's properly initialized, and we've added some local variables here. So what's happening is we have a generic text box. The form builder will do all of the work to tell us whether or not this particular user, given the state of the object at this particular time, has the access rights to enable them to either see the field and be able to edit the field. We also have an event for when the value has been changed, and we're going to bind the value of the text box to this value UX and we'll see how that all works in a minute. So you can see here we've declared ourselves a text box to actually hold the value. We're setting up some additional parameters here. During initialization, we're just initializing the base class. And in the parameters set function, we're going to actually do some interesting stuff. Now, one thing that we have found as an issue with the WASM Blazor components is that if you have a field in the same position on two separate tabs of the same type, it doesn't always call the Uninitialized async. We're not exactly sure why it does this at the moment, but the behavior that we've seen is if on row 1 in the left we have a string on tab 1, and if on row 1 in the left field we have a string on tab 3, if you're navigating between tab 1 and tab 3, it doesn't call the Uninitialized async, but it does call the OnParameterSet. So as I navigate from tab 1 to tab 3, the OnParameterSet will always be called. So what we do is OnParameterSet is this is where we're actually going to do the interesting thing about initializing this new field. So you can see there are two things that are happening. We're executing ExtractValues here, and what ExtractValues is doing is it's looking at the field user experience and the definition. So I've taken some code from the string example, and we have created a text box that will be used to display the image URL. And you can see we've bound it to the canEdit variable here that we're ultimately going to get from the form builder. We have set up a value changed event handler that we'll look at in a minute, and we're binding it to a value called value UX here. Now you'll notice that the Uninitialized async is just going to call the base Uninitialize. So if we do need to do anything during initialization, we do it here. One thing that we have noticed as a limitation of the Blazor WASM functionality, at least in .NET 5, is that if you have, let's say on tab 1, row 1 in the left field, a string, and on tab 2, row 1 in the left field position, there is a string, and you go to tab 1, it seems to initialize that successfully, but if you then go to tab 2, it doesn't call the Uninitialized async for that successfully. Now we're not 100% sure why. If you have a string on tab 1 and in that location you have a date in tab 2, the Uninitialized async gets called successfully for both. But if you have the field is the same field type in the same position on multiple tabs, the Uninitialized async is only called for the first initialization of the field. So what we have found as a good workaround for that is to do all of the useful initialization on the OnParameters So even in that case where on tab 1 and tab 2, on row 1 in the left position they both happen to be strings, the OnParameters is called every time the page refreshes. So this is where we tend to do all of the interesting stuff. Now we have extracted that into a standard ExtractValues function. So again, this is a standard that we use within Great Ideaz. And essentially what we're doing is interrogating the information that's coming back from the form builder to tell us whether the user is actually allowed to edit and modify the field, what the XML element name is going to be, and then what we're looking at is what is the value of that XML element name in the current version of the record stored in the database. So if this is basically being displayed for anything other than version 1 of the record, what did the record contain in that X element position? So what we're then going to do is we're going to say, well, by default, first time this thing has been shown, the data changes is going to be empty. So we're just going to display in the user experience what the value was from the database. But if this record has been displayed and the user's navigated away, maybe come back, then that value may have changed. So the my instance responds to the data changes of the record. So as somebody changes the information in a particular field, we're going to update the data changes X element inside the my instance. And you'll see how we do that for this particular field in a minute. But essentially what this piece of code here is doing is saying, if the user experience has changed this field value and it's navigated away onto a different tab, come back again, navigated away, come back again, use the value that the user last edited. Otherwise, if the user has not changed the value in this field from the database, then use the value from the database. So if the user is on this field and has made a change and they're navigating away, then our onBlur event is calling this value changed. So one thing that we're doing is basically making sure that there are no Unicode characters in here. And then if the user is allowed to edit the field, we're going to change the XML. So the value changed code basically makes sure that we don't have invalid Unicode characters in here, checks that the user is actually allowed to edit this field, and then calls the change XML functionality. And what change XML functionality is doing is it's going to take the value that's currently being displayed and create a new X element using the name of the element in the record, and then it's going to call the myInstanceChanged field. So what this change field will do is it will look at the value in the database, it will look at the value it's being given and decide whether or not we need to make a change to the next version of the record in the database. So let's say, for the sake of argument, on the version of the record that we read, the display image URL is pointing to a.png. If the user changes that to b.png, then there will be a change field request that says that this X element is going to change from apng to bpng. If the user changes their mind and comes back and changes it back to apng, then that change will be reversed. So essentially the change field value will be removed out of the data changes. So all of this is basically handled by the framework. Okay, so everything that you're seeing here in terms of what's happening with this field, in terms of reading the value out of the current version of the record, in terms of validating that value and writing the change back to the record, pretty much all of that is being handled for you by the framework, and you can pretty much copy and paste this code into your new custom fields. So let's see what this looks like in terms of the user experience now. So here you can see my display image URL now has an extra text box. Okay, so this is going to enable me to enter my image URL. So let's say that I'm going to put in here test.png, and if I navigate away from this, you can see that the save button has now been enabled because there's changes to save on this form. I can save those changes. I can navigate away from the page. So as I navigate away from the page, I go back to here. And then if I come back to my field, you can see I've got my test PNG, and I can change that to test ABC PNG. If I navigate off there, I can click the save button. So what's happening here is that the record is being read from the database. Initially, it's coming back with an empty string. I am able to change the value of that string, and then when I save the record, that change is being saved into the underlying database record. Okay, so we can now start tidying things up. At the moment, we still have this title that we should get rid of, and this field here is a little bit narrow, right? We're expecting this to go to 100% of the field width. So let's go into our backend code and tidy that up. So to start off with, I'm just going to remove our H3 title since we don't need that anymore. And I'm going to provide a default selector that basically is going to match this class name here with a width 100% override. So let's have a look at this. And as you can see, the title has now been removed, and we've expanded the width of the text box for putting our HTML image in. And we have expanded the size of the text box available for us to enter our URL. So what would be nice now is if we do have a URL to actually display the image. So to display our image, what we're going to do is just a simple test to see whether or not we have a value for the URL. And if we do have a value for the URL, then we're just going to display a simple image tag with the source of the image. So let's have a look at how this works in the code. So here is our code. We're looking for test ABC PNG. And if we look at the image here, we see that we have an image where the source is test ABC PNG. Clearly we aren't seeing an image there, so let's go and load a real image and see what happens. So I personally like to look at puppies, so let's copy the link to this image, paste it here, save, Okay, so let's try out our new display image. So as you can see, we have at the moment no image available. I've gone and found an image off the internet. If I paste this image in here, you can see that the display image URL is here, and here is the picture of my adorable puppy there. And if I hit the done button here, so if I go somewhere else and come back to my image, you can see that my URL has now been used to successfully save and display the image. So this is the really cool thing about the TrellisPark framework. Not only have we given you a very expressive user experience creator tool that allows you to use a set of default field types and to be able to display any form, any information, any set of tabs with any lifecycle state transition diagram. And on every single one of those tabs, you can say whether or not the tab is visible to a user or not. Within that tab, you can define any combination of rows that you want. And within each of those rows, you can specify any type of field that you want to display. And there really is no limit to the complexity and functionality that you can add to your user experience.
To learn more about Great Ideaz products and solutions, visit greatideaz.com. That's Great Ideaz with a Z.com. Thanks.